I'd like to talk about access to nature in this debate in relation to protection of the natural world and indeed access to it through the prism of my Isle of Wight constituency. So I'm going to be very parochial, but I'm also going to pitch a series of arguments to this minister, as I have done with previous ministers. But I thank the honourable lady for securing this debate, and it's nice to see the minister in place, as indeed it is great to see a fellow co-chair of the Ukraine APPG on the front bench opposite. In the time that I have, I would like to outline why I believe that the Isle of Wight should be, for the purposes of the natural world and human access to it, be seen as a single whole and not currently as it is as a patchwork of designations with some undesignated land. Secondly, I'm going to make the case for a specific island designation. It's not a national park on the island, but an island park, an island designation, which is a bit different to a national park, which I believe should be introduced, certainly for the Isle of Wight, but potentially for other islands as well, Anglesey, the Scottish Islands, etc. I had hoped, or maybe I misunderstood this, I thought there was going to be primary legislation that was coming out of the Glover Review, and we were looking at the idea of city parks, but also as part of that, I would look at the idea of an island park as well. In support of those two, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm going to explain why the Isle of Wight has a genuine depth and uniqueness of diversity of animal life, of marine and landscape habitat geology, which is remarkable and unique in the United Kingdom, and why, frankly, it should be much more valued by policymakers in London. But let me make my argument in a little bit more detail first. The island is said to represent England in miniature. So the east resembles Sussex and Kent with its thick hedges and coppices. The stone walls around the Undercliff and Cornwall, Undercliff and the south side of the Isle of Wight resemble Cornwall, as do the sandy little coves. In the southwest where I live, the windswept chalk downs somewhat resemble parts of Dorset. And the creeks of Yarmouth, Newtown and Wootton on the north of the island resemble those of similar types that you'd find in Devon. Being an island also importantly means that we have not had the invasion of invasive non-native species such as deer, red squirrels and escaped mink from mink farms. We're free of those. The island has a series of internationally and nationally important nature conservation sites, and I'm going to list them. These are special areas of marine conservation, and as part of an island designation, an island park, we would include marine as well as marinescape as well as landscape. We have the Newtown National Nature Reserve. We have 41, a remarkable number, of special areas of sites of special scientific interest, SSSIs, and we have 395 local wildlife sites. We have 2 of the southeast of England's 4 heritage coasts, and just over half of the island is an AONB, and it should be much more. Somebody turned up in 1963 from the ministry, spent half a day in the island, and threw a few splotches of A and B on the map and then left. It wasn't a well-conducted exercise, I believe. We are again applying for the dark sky status for the southwest of the island. And I have to say, I got back, I think, last Friday morning at 2 AM. I got the midnight ferry down from London. And even with a partial moon, I have to say, the intensity of the night sky where I live in the southwest is absolutely breathtaking. And to have dark skies and to see the night skies, fewer and fewer people, sadly, in our light polluted civilization does, it is both humbling and uplifting at the same time. To put all those explanations and those categorizations into terms that geographers might recognise, and again I apologise for listing, but I'm using these sort of geographical terms from Natural England and other organisations. Our land and seascape includes broadleaf mixed and new woodland, maritime cliff and slope, lowland calcareous grassland, coastal and floodplain, grazing marsh, lowland meadows, reed bed, lowland dry acidic grassland, fens, lowland heathland, the chalk downs that provide the spine of the island going from Bembridge on one side to the Needles all the way over in the west. We have saline lagoons, we have mudflats, we have coastal sand dunes and coastal vegetative shingle. I'd also mention specifically our chines, which are unique to us, although there are a few in West Dorset, I believe, as well, which are spectacular steep-sided gorges where rivers and streams flow down to the sea and over thousands of years have carved their way through soft sandstone. Shanklin Chine, celebrated by Keats, is one of the more famous we have on the island, but there are chines all over the island, including near me on the south side. What does all this mean? This means that our English landscape in miniature and our range of multiple different habitats and our role as an island means that we're pretty unique geologically and geographically, and I'll come to a little bit more in a second, but we are also home to many different species that are, some of which are unique to the Isle of Wight, but actually more importantly, we have species that are still existing and sometimes flourishing on the island compared to the near extinction levels that we've had in other parts of the United Kingdom. These include red squirrels, dormice, and water voles, because we don't have grey squirrels and we don't have lots of escaped mink. And I thank the Isle of Wight Red Squirrel Trust for their great work on looking after injured red squirrels that you sadly see occasionally on the roads. We have some of the UK's rarest bats. I think we have 17 or 18 species identified on the Isle of Wight. They include the great horseshoe bat, very rare nowadays for those who know their bats. I don't, but you know, I read the work and talk to people who do know their bats. We have the Bechstein bat and indeed the grey long-eared bat, and I thank the Isle of Wight Natural History and Archaeological Society for the information. Our specialised flora includes early gentian, which is found in Wiltshire, Dorset and the Isle of Wight. Field cow wheat, present only in a few locations in the country, and wood calamine, which we have in a single dry chalk valley on the island. In relation to insects, the island is the sole British location of the Glanville fritillary butterfly and the reddish buff moth, and we recently, about a decade ago, we refound the beehawk moth, which was rediscovered in part of the island. I'm sorry to list stuff. I want to get this stuff on the public record because it is important for the arguments that I'm going to make. For our birds, our marshes, the Solent as a whole is a Ramsar designated site, so wetlands of international importance. Specifically, Brading Marsh and the Newtown and Western Yarm marshes and estuaries are internationally important for migrating and wading birds and the insects and plants that exist in that same estuary. Saline estuary, I think, is the geographer's term, that exists in that habitat. The sea eagle, the second largest in the world, was reintroduced in England on the Isle of Wight, and there is now a nesting pair, I think, in Brading Marshes. Buzzards, once rare, are now relatively plentiful, especially in the middle of the island. As regards our marine environment, the areas surrounding the island are protected by marine conservation zones, special protection areas, and special areas of conservation. There are 2 species of seahorse that you will see to greater or lesser extent, and sadly often nowadays to a lesser extent around the British coast, the spinny seahorse and the short-snouted seahorse, bit of an alliterative struggle, that one. Both exist in and around the shores of the Isle of Wight. We have other rare or semi-rare marine species, native oyster, peacock's tail, stalk jellyfish. There is a plan to reintroduce the white-clawed crayfish, the English crayfish, having died out in many parts of the UK because of the bigger American crayfish that you find in pret-a-manger sandwiches, etc. And I thank the Wild Heart Animal Sanctuary for that potential work. There is a purpose for me listing these, is to show the Minister the depth and variety of wildlife that exists on the island, which is relatively rare in other parts of the United Kingdom. There is a little bit more of the list, and then I shall come to the points. We have seagrass meadows in Osborne Bay, Yarmouth and Boldner. Seagrass nowadays is very important for carbon capture. This is why a project is now taking seeds from those coastal waters around the Isle of Wight and Osborne in Yarmouth and Boldner and replanting them in the Bewley River in the Solent. So our natural world and the relative strength, and I accept that it is a relative strength, of our natural world is now being used for the benefit of the wider UK, as it will with the crayfish, as it will with the seabeds, as it will indeed, as it is being indeed for the sea eagle. So all this, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and thank you for bearing with me there, means that our variety, our diversity and our depth of habitat, natural flora, of common, rare and unique insects, marine and animal life is pretty much unique in the United Kingdom. A word, if I may, on geology too. We have one of the most complex geologies that you'll find pretty much anywhere in the world, but certainly in Britain. The Undercliff, a breathtakingly beautiful area along the southern tip of the island, is the most geologically unstable inhabited part of Europe, with sadly our roads occasionally slipping alarmingly towards the sea. The last time that happened when we had about 75 metres of road, a road as it was, that parted company with the rest of the road during a particularly bad storm 8 years ago. Sadly, that road hasn't yet been repaired. Along the southwest of the island, we have a near complete exposure of Cretaceous coast, Wealden rock, orange. So if you look at the Isle of Wight, you will see white rock and you'll see orange rock. They're roughly from the same period, about 120 million years ago. The Wealden rock produces dinosaur fossils in relative abundance, which is why that the Isle of Wight is Europe's #1 site for the discovery of dinosaur, fossilised bones of dinosaurs. And indeed, we have dinosaur footprint casts near where I live in Brook Bay. And without sounding like a member of the Flintstones, we actually have a family dinosaur, because my an iguanodon, I try not to sound like a dinosaur, I guess, but an iguanodon fossilised bones was found on my great-great-great-granddad's farm in about 1870. So there is actually an iguanodon coelii. There is some discussion amongst paleontologists about whether it's a true species or a subspecies. I will let others argue that point. But the point is, our wildlife is pretty unique. Our landscapes, you will not find a concentration of different landscapes in any other part of the United Kingdom. That is not to question the beauty of moors, the beauty of the Lake District, the beauty of bits of Yorkshire, the beauty of Dorset, but you don't get the concentration of almost every type of habitat you will find in the UK in one place, apart from the Isle of Wight. You don't get the concentration of wildlife, both common, rare on the mainland, and unique to the island, anywhere else. And frankly, you don't get the geology as well. Turning briefly to our access to nature, actually our access to nature is relatively good. We have 500 miles of footpaths. So actually we have, and largely because probably we avoided enclosures back in the 18th century because we were quite slow to take up these things. So therefore our medieval rights of way that existed for decades and hundreds of years before that, we kept them into the modern era. We also have about 2,000 hectares of open access land, and we already have a coastal path, which in most places goes along the coast. So we have some 2 million visitors a year. Frankly, the case back in the 1940s and 50s for making the Isle of Wight Britain's first national park was absolutely overwhelming. And J.B. Priestley, one of the great authors of the 20th century, argued as much. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. I'm not arguing for a national park, but I am arguing for a specific island designation for the reasons that I'm outlining, because of the uniqueness of the island, the uniqueness of our geology, etc. So we should have that unique role. And indeed, I think the Honourable Member for Worcester, my Honourable friend for Worcester, was talking about saving the Shire, looking at the celebration of the landscape by people who've written about it. Nowhere, again, for its size, compares with the Isle of Wight on that score. So Lord Tennyson used the landscape in many different ways, and indeed the seascape, and indeed the Solent, in Crossing the Bar, a breathtakingly beautiful poem about crossing from the mainland to the island, but metaphorically from life to death. It was one of the last poems that he wrote. John Keats, Endymion, his most famous poem, A Thing of Beauty is a Joy Forever, was written probably about Shanklin Chine. He was bowled over by the beauty, the natural beauty of the island, as have many other people. Turner sketched and painted on the island. The freshwater and Bonshirt sets in the 19th century were hugely influential in the artistic heritage of the island. And some of the finest collections of pastoral poetry, which is something that we've tended to specialise in, have come out of the 19th and 20th centuries, including some breathtakingly beautiful poetry. In fact, I think the daughter of William Makepeace Thackeray asked on a visit to the island in 1853, is there no one here who is commonplace? Is everyone either a poet, a genius, or a painter? Now, considering that she was talking about previous constituents, I will undoubtedly say yes, but it shows certainly that our countryside and our seascape and our landscape were celebrated by many people. Right, I will come to my political argument now. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Deputy Speaker, for bearing with me. I hope I'm constructing an argument, if doing it in a reasonable amount of detail, which I want to get onto the record. We have a single designation. It's called the UNESCO Biosphere, but it has no standing in UK law. How about we think of ways that it could do? And I thank, on that point, I thank Joel Bateman at the Isle of Wight AONB for his great work leading that campaign. In UK designations, over half our land is AONB, which I believe is wrongly parcelled into different areas. And if you're going to treat one bit of the countryside as a unified entity, surely it's going to be an island. And therefore, surely it should have been the Isle of Wight. I've driven through the Cotswolds AONB. It's very beautiful, don't get me wrong. But there are flat, boring bits in the middle of the Cotswolds AONB. They didn't parcel out different lumps. They took the Cotswolds as a single entity. So why is a much smaller part of the world, like the Isle of Wight, not treated as a single entity, but effectively given a patchwork, because somebody turned up on the ferry at midday and left at 6 o'clock, potted around the island in a sort of Austin 7 in 1963, made a few notes, and we, not only did we not get a national park, but we didn't even get a unified area of outstanding national beauty. So I made the argument about our protected landscape, although fragmented, is incredibly special. Our finite landscape is also in danger, Mr. Deputy Speaker, of being damaged. I will quote Natural England. Urban development on the Isle of Wight is spreading, with waste disposal sites, extensive holiday and industrial developments, and caravan parks blurring the edges of settlements. The extent to which rural landscapes on the island have been disturbed by urban development has increased 27% between 1960 and 2007. Some of our rivers are damaged. We know that badly. We know the scandal of dirty rivers now. And on that point, Southern Water, thankfully, are now using the Isle of Wight as an example of best practice, how to clean up rivers. So I'm hoping that our natural regeneration in the island will actually be one that the rest of Britain will be catching up with in the years to come. But we are again in this area leading the way. I believe that an all-island designation, Mr. Deputy Speaker, should encompass maritime and landscape. Why not do both? Why not have both those landscapes in a single entity? A single protected landscape status, an island designation throughout, and I'll come very briefly to what it was going to mention, to what could be in that, would also fit with the island's single unitary authority and our biosphere status. It would also, frankly, help with our branding. The island is special in many ways, but we are not one of the richest parts of Britain, and we are certainly not one of the richest parts of the southeast. And getting that environmental tourism, getting that ecology tourism would be of significant benefit. Our tourism is already accounting for over $500 million, about 560 million, to the economy from those 2 million visitors. And if I had to choose between having controlled development, which looks after the island's housing need, but doesn't build for a mainland market and protects our landscape for islanders, because it is important in its own right, and it's also important for our tourism economy, I would choose that, rather than the endless urban sprawl, which large-scale development is just completely unsuited to the island. So an island park designation, for me, would see the island as a single entity and would be ecologically and environmentally treated as such. Access to nature would be given for wherever that was necessary, respecting the laws, but primarily this would function for the benefit of nature recovery plans. Now, as I say, I'm sorry that I thought that the Glover review was going to be resulting in primary legislation, and I am winding up, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I assure you. I normally make very concise speeches. I feel a bit guilty whenever I go over more than 15 minutes. I'm winding up in the next 2 to 3 minutes. I apologise. An island park would function effectively like an AONB throughout. So it would rule out large-scale development, so we wouldn't build for a mainland market anymore, but we would, importantly, look after the island's housing need, something that basically we haven't done for 50 years. So we would have probably more affordable housing, more social housing, more housing association housing, and that would be our priority, to get our youngsters onto the market. If you want to retire to the Isle of Wight, that's great. That's what the back pages of the county press are for, because there are 500 homes for sale at any one time. But if we're building, we build for islanders, mainly the young, but also occasionally the old when they need to downsize. But I would seek a ban on large-scale housing development in favour of smaller developments in existing communities, using the few brownfield sites, but also maybe increasing the density mildly in our areas, in our towns. I'm frustrated, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that whenever I talk to the government or Natural England, they say that they're looking at Cheshire AONB, the Yorkshire Wolds AONB, as justified as they would be, and they're looking at an extension of them and 2 potentially new AONBs. We are going to have to wait 10 years for an extension for a review into our AONB. Why? The next time we bring in a landscape protection bill, can we not have, if we're going to have city parks, why don't we look at a special island designation? Both for the Isle of Wight, we could pioneer, as we often do, and then Anglesey and the Isle of Arran, the Outer Hebrides, all these places could join that. Summing up, the Prime Minister has committed, the previous Prime Minister, but this one I presume is also committing to 30 by 30, an additional 4,000 square kilometres. I welcome that. And in the Isle of Wight, you have a natural partner who wants to work with you. The Council have committed to an all-island designation, and so have I. We want to see that, because we want to see, and we want to be an example of best practice, how human beings can live in harmony with the natural world, how we can get a nature recovery, which we need, because we are becoming less biodiverse, that is obvious. If you can do it on the island with its multiple different types of species, with its multiple different types of habitat, we could learn how to do it elsewhere as well. So that is for me, a no-brainer, as the Americans would say. So if the government wants to work with me on this, I would welcome it. To recap, the island should, for the purposes of the natural world and human enjoyment of it, be seen as a single whole. There is a very strong case for introducing an islands designation into our landscape protection, and I believe it should be introduced first in the Isle of Wight. And for the reason for this is both the uniqueness of our environment, the uniqueness of the habitats, the uniqueness of the wildlife, and the uniqueness of our geology. And I look forward to talking further with government about this. Thank you, sir.